Chapter 7, the final chapter in this series, Sails and Rigging. Some sailors talk about the sails like their designs and builds are sacred, but many options will work. Just most options won't work that well, especially to windward, where making progress to windward is pretty difficult. Some guys like to build boats with precision and then pass on sailmaking to a professional. I'm not sure why, because making decent sails is cheaper and easier than making a boat. If all this sailmaking is too complicated, this boat is designed to use a canvas tarp off the shelf from Harbor Freight. 6 by 8 feet, 48 square feet. It's underpowered for some conditions, but you could row into light airs and sail at beam reach and downwind, of course. If the wind picks up, you might even make a little progress to windward. Really simple sails will make you a 65 square foot lug sail designed for Ian Uhtred's Elfin, which that sail would be a good performance purchase, and it would fit on this boat pretty well. Another option is to make sails out of poly tarp. The advantage of this is that you can just buy a big tarp for cheap and cut it down to the shape of the sail. Maybe sew a little shape into it even. You can go through Plices or the Wayback Machine to access the Jim McCallick newsletter, the archives, and included in that mountain of good information is advice on polytarp sails. That Jim McCallick newsletter is incredible for people interested in small boats. I made my sails from 14 yards of sailcloth purchased through Duckworks. I used a handful of 3/8-inch grommets on the mizzen sail and the head of the mainsail, and some 1/2-inch grommets everywhere else. I used this General Tools grommet kit I got at Ace Hardware. Judging by the photo, though, it might be short on count of grommets. For thread, I use an exterior rated thread. I get it at Joann's. Finally, the sewing machine. It doesn't need to be like some crazy fancy sewing machine for this thin Dacron fabric, but it does need a walking foot to be able to sew the zigzag stitch. That zigzag stitch with a walking foot is highly recommended. It's basically essential for something like this. For advice on making sails, this Emiliano Marino's Sailmaker's Apprentice book it's the best resource, and I use it extensively when I'm working on sails like this. And where I veer away from that book, I make mistakes.
It's going to be easier to go over these directly instead of just trying to talk over a picture of these on the screen. So these are drawings of the two sails. The mizzen sail at 10 square feet, the main sail 68 square feet. Let's go over this mizzen sail first. So the mizzen sail, 7 foot 6 inches tall, 2 foot 8 inches deep from a perpendicular from that luff, and that perpendicular is 1 foot 6 inches up from that tack. So 1 foot 6 inches measured across there. This broad seaming, so I did, first of all, my 36-inch wide cloth, my fabric, I cut it in half so that these were 18-inch strips, and then that bottom edge, I turned those so that they were 18 inches across this way, running down, and that allowed me to do a little broad seaming here. These broad seaming, I mean, you almost don't have to do it on a mizzen because the mizzen should be pretty flat. What else do I need to say? 1/2-inch overlap on these seams. I mean, 1 inch extra at this luff edge and 1.5 inches extra at the foot. This is really almost excessive on a mizzen sail. It can be pretty simple. The mainsail. Oh, one more thing on the mizzen sail. This spar that you're going to use to put outhaul tension on that should be about 3 foot 4 inches long. You could put some curve in it, but from where if you put curve in it, those two tie-off points should be 3 foot 4 inches long. 3 feet 4 inches apart. Okay, back to the mainsail. So main distances on this mainsail. There's a measurement for each of the sides of this 4-sided sail, and then a measurement for each diagonal. And you'll see in the video how I use that so all the angles are accurate. So let's start at the luff. The luff, 93.5 inches. The head, 91.5 inches. The leech is, 152 inches. And then the foot, 90 inches. The diagonal from the clew to the throat is 123 inches. And then the diagonal from the peak to the tack is 171 inches. And that'll get you your outline. But you are going to add a little bit of room on the foot, about 2 inches on the foot, maybe about 1.5 inches on the luff. And also where this yard attaches on the head, you can add a little bit of space there too, maybe 1.5 inches. I don't have it marked on the diagram. Where to next? So let's look at the how this is going to get rigged. This line here is the line for the mast. The mast is going to attach at the tack, and then about 30 inches up from the throat on the head is where that mast should roughly attach. And you'll see in the rigging is that I made a little alpine butterfly loop in the line that's attaching the head to the yard. These broad seam lines are kind of tricky. So what I did for those is, so some say that the shape that you add, the broad seaming that you add in a sail like this, isn't just to add curve, it's to shape it and to put the curve in a specific location. And so if you want the sail to be a real powerful sail, but not really move to windward so well, you would move this broad seaming line further back towards the middle, and you would make it deeper. But if you want kind of a mix of performance, like I'm trying to go for this, you're going to put it about 1/3 of the way back. So what I did is I measured this mast, or I located this mast line, and then drew a perpendicular 1/3 of the way back to be the point for those broad seam lines, to try to locate the curve about 1/3 of the way back from like the leading edge of this sail. How deep you put it and how much broad seaming you put in will add more shape. I actually added a little less shape on this sail than I usually do, and I haven't used it a ton, but I'm happy with it so far. So what else do we need to discuss? These reefing points. These reefing points, I wanted to go about 1/3 of the way up the luff. So about 1/3 of the way from the tack to the throat. So 32 inches to this first reefing point, then another 32 inches to this second reefing point. But you increase that on the back edge, on the leech, so that it pulls the back edge of the sail up a little bit. So 34 inches to the first reef point, and then another 34 inches. Now we'll just pull that clew up a little bit out of the way. What other dimensions do I need to discuss on here? Again, I split the 36-inch wide, the yard wide Dacron fabric to be 18 inches wide. So these are about 18-inch strips and about 1/2 inch overlap on those. The spars, so the yard that'll go up on the head over here, this yard, basically I just added a couple inches to that 91.5 inches. 97 inches should be good. And 1.5 inches square tapered. That taper should be the thickest point where the mast passes through. So that 1.5 inches will be about 33 inches back. And then it'll taper maybe down to 1 inch square down by the throat, and then maybe 1 inch square, maybe slightly less back at the peak. Then this spar, that adds its outhaul tension. Mine is 110 inches from attachment point to attachment point, about an inch and a half square. I'm really happy with that dimension on this spar. One thing I'm not ecstatic about is how I located this curve. I have one that I did that I like, where I located the curve maybe a quarter of the way back, and that gives you some room to clear your head. This one's more of like a whole gradual curve from front to back, which, I mean, it works fine. I don't think it looks as good though this way. So, Mizzen sail, main sail diagram. A discussion on broad seaming. So these dark areas here are marking broad seams. This line is marking broad seams. And what these broad seams are is you get your fabric overlapped a little bit, and you've got your straight seam, and then you bring in the other edge a little bit, and when you do that, it adds some shape. And so it makes like a cup shape in your cells. It makes them a little bit 3D. That, combined with the excess fabric around some of these edges, when you pull that straight, it will force that shape into the sail. The standard broad seaming, according to Emilio Marino, is a half inch for every 30 inches, but mine is a quarter inch. This quarter inch dimension is because I split my fabric that was a yard wide, 36 inches wide, into 18-inch strips, because each of these strips is 18 inches. And so if I was going to do a half inch, that would double the broad seaming, and that would double the shape. So I did half the broad seaming, a quarter inch every 30 inches. This quarter inch every 30 inches is kind of on the sparse side, and I was generous with this, and I was actually, I wouldn't say I was closer to a half inch, but maybe 5/16 every 30 inches. And yeah.
I made the mizzen sail first is to make my bigger mistakes on this smaller sail. My approach improves in the second half of this video when I work on the main sail. I measured out the dimensions and used a carpenter string to show the edges. The main sail, I just put masking tape on the floor, which was easier, just like little tape in the corners. This sail is easy, this mizzen sail, it's easy to lay out. And then I split the sailcloth into strips, into these 18-inch strips, and then split the foot into 3 sections. And I put all this cloth down on the outline and tape my seams flat so they overlap about a half an inch. Then I come back and take in the broad seaming and tape them back up. The broad seaming on this mizzen sail is just about negligible. I mean, it's a quarter inch with this halved sailcloth yardage where it's 18 inches wide. That quarter inch broad seaming for every 30 inches is like just about nothing on this. I gave my sail way too much shape with the idea that I'm going to turn it into a jib also, and I don't like it, to be honest. I don't think the sail shape turned out well for me. Yours shouldn't have the distortion mine does. Mine has way too much shape. This mizzen sail is small, so it's not a real challenge to get it through the machine. Just kind of slowly peel back that tape as you progress through a stitch. I used that zigzag stitch, that walking foot zigzag stitch the entire time and never took my machine off that setting, making both sails. With the seams sewn, the sail goes back on the outline and rounded edges get drawn with a batten and a pencil. The foot and the luff get rounded to add maybe an inch. I left the leech straight. Some people take the leech in a touch. Reinforcements for the corners are just a larger circle on a smaller circle that gets sewn together and then cut up to fit corners and lace up the luff. With a small sail and small forces, these are only 3 inches or so in diameter. 5 additional reinforcements on the luff of the sail split the luff into 6 equal lengths so I can lace it to the mast. The reinforcements on the luff and the corners get sewn onto the sail with the larger circle facing outwards. So the face of the larger circle is out and the edge of the inner circle is hidden behind it. And then sew to trace along the inside of each arc with a seam, and you try to spread out the forces into a larger area. The goal is to distribute the force across a larger area of cloth. The edges get reinforced by twice folding, well, I guess 3 times folding a 3-inch wide strip in on itself. So I measure the widths and lengths before cutting these strips. And then they get it folded in half first, so they'd be like 1.5 inches wide. Then each half gets folded in one more time so that the edges are just about meeting at that middle seam. I find a smooth tool like the handle of scissors help make a good crease. These get sewn onto the edges of the sail. Finally, grommets. Based on the advice to use a hot knife to make all cuts on Dacron sailcloth, I've had success in the past with heating up a sacrificial grommet and then melted grommet holes. This little Mizzen got 3/8-inch grommets all around, and I think the small grommets didn't have the thermal mass to do that job. They couldn't retain enough heat to melt through it. So for the rest of this build, I just ended up using the punch kit, the punch that came with that kit, and it's done fine on other sails too. I just wanted a little more reinforcement with melting that. So the mizzen sail is quick. On to the mainsail, which is a little more complicated and a bit more difficult. The measurements on this mainsail are from that pile of green canvas you see on the floor that was it's in the background of some of these videos. It's also the sail in some of the early videos of using the boat. I put that 68 square foot sail on a handful of little boats, and I really liked it, the size and the shape of that. Even though the cloth I made it out of is heavy and it stretched out quickly. Transferring the measurements to the floor involved triangulating from an original point. So secure the hook of your measuring tape so it can rotate around that point and put it. I start at the tack of the sail and secure the hook of the measuring tape so it can rotate around where the tack of the sail is. And then you can draw an arc up from that tack, 93.5 inches, the distance of the luff. So you've got the arc for the distance from the luff. Then you come back to your tack and you go to about 90 degrees in the other direction. And you draw an arc that's 90 inches, which is the length of the foot. Then you connect the arc that's 93.5 inches for the luff and the arc that's 90 inches for the foot. You connect these with the distance of the diagonal between the two, 123 inches between these 2 points. And so as long as you get that 123-inch diagonal, you've got a triangle now that will match the lower triangle of this sail. And so these 3 points will mark the throat, the tack, and the clew of the sail. Then you can use similar triangulation to find the peak and get the whole shape. The drawing at the beginning of this is drawn to scale, so it should look like that drawing. If it doesn't, something's off. I found masking tape on the floor to mark the corners worked a lot better than my contractor string technique, where I was marking out the mizzen. I laid out the full width of fabric first and then split my fabric into 18-inch wide strips before laying it out again. This bigger sail is going to pose a number of challenges that that tiny mizzen didn't, as you can see already as I'm folding over this cloth to be able to access those half-inch overlap for the seams. Just like the mizzen, flat sail, flat seams all gets taped out first. And then I'm going to measure out where I'm going to put in the broad seams, which is a little bit of a process. I measure out where the mast is going to sit, so it's from the tack to about 1/3 of the way back on the head of the sail. And I lay piece of batten to mark the mast location. And so then I know that's going to be my sail vertically. And so I can measure back perpendicularly so I can mark perpendiculars from that vertical to measure a third of the distance back from the leading edge of the sail. And then that's about where I want the deepest point of my sail to be. So I can I just kind of eyeball how deep I want my broad seaming to be, but that's where I want my broad seaming to max out. And so I lay another batten at that, like a third the depth of the sail, and then I can draw lines from the corners to mark out where the broad seaming will start at. These marks really only need to go across the tape that's on the seams. You don't have to mark on the cloth for this. So now I know where that broad seaming is going to start, and I can use that 1/4 inch per 30 inches of seam rule to measure out the broad seaming. So I just measure out from where the broad seaming is going to start on the seam to about where the cloth ends. And then I say, okay, if this is 20 inches, then I know it's going to be about 2/3 of a 1/4 inch. And I might round up and get close to a 1/4 inch. I want just a little bit extra on this broad seaming, and I'm happy with the shape of this sail. So mark out all that, where that broad seaming is going to end up, and peel back the tape, and then bring that fabric together, and then put that tape back down, and that marks out your broad seaming. Now I'm ready to sew those seams. This is a challenge with a full-size sail like this. I tried running my machine under suspended. So, okay, this is a challenge with a sail like this. I tried moving my machine, sliding it along under sailcloth that was suspended on two horses, and that didn't work. Then I just figured I'd keep working on the ground, which is a pain, but I think I kind of got the yoga down by finally moving the sail, this rolled up sail, through the machine and running the pedal on the machine by squeezing it between my knees and then peeling off that tape as I make progress. With the sail solid now, I can lie it out and use a batten to put a little round on the foot, the luff, the head, 1.5 inches on the luff and head, and more on the foot if you want a big loose foot. Some people like that, the look of the big loose foot, which, yeah. I measured an extra 1/2 inch all around and folded it over and then sewed it down just to create a solid edge. Now I mark out all my reef points. So the luff I split into about thirds and go 32 inches up from the tack from that first reef point on the luff, and 32 inches again for the second reef point. The leech gets a little more at 34 inches just to pull up that back end of the sail when you put a reef in. And with that, I'm ready for all my big reinforcement patches. On this bigger sail, the reinforcement patches are 3 layers of 6, 5, and 4-inch radii. 2 sets of this get sewn together. One gets cut into quarters to reinforce the 4 attachment points for reefing. The other gets the angles of each corner of the sail marked out and cut and sewn onto the sail. Then, to lace on the yard, 3 smaller 2-layer reinforcement patches of 4 and 3-inch radii get sewn together, cut in half, and then those half circles are sewn onto the head of the sail, spaced out evenly to divide the head into 7 equal lengths. All these patches, just like on the Mizzen, get sailed with the seams of the smaller circles enclosed within the larger circle in the sailcloth. Making the strips to add a hem to the edges means more 3-inch wide strips folded into quarters again, just like on the Mizzen, and then that gets sewn, added to all the edges and goes right over the patches, and you end up with what's that? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 layers of cloth in some spots, and It's a little tough on the machine, but my kind of average machine does okay getting through it. Grommets on this, 14 in total. 8 of these are half-inch grommets at the corners of the sail, and on the reef points, the other 6 are 3/8-inch grommets where I'm going to lace the head to the yard. Finally, reef tie points. 3-inch square patches get cut out, and then 2 3/8-inch holes get punched into them on a diagonal. I need to make 16 of these, and they're going to get sewn to the sail. So it's going to be 4 locations, like 4 tie-off points for each like reef point, and 4 of these locations are going to be on each side of the sail. So really each reef point gets 8, but they're lined up. They're one on top of another. Draw a line between the reefing points that you've got the grommets in for, and then I move it 2 inches towards the foot of the sail where I'm going to put the center, the holes on these. It makes it so you can tie up the extra sail at the foot and avoid getting in the way of the tension across the sail. I put these 10 inches from the edges so they're a little bit closer to the edges, and then divide the middle section into thirds. The 10 inches at the edges, I end up with more bulk sail at the edges as you bring it in. I heard a tip to use clear packing tape to attach these to the sail. The idea is that you can just sew right over the clear tape and then it comes off clean right out from under those seams. It mostly worked. There's less adhesion on this than masking tape, but it was easier to clean up. When going to sew these down, I matched the patches on the opposite side of the sail so they overlap cleanly and the holes across the diagonal even for the most part lined up. Then I sailed through all 3 layers of cloth. This is another tedious task, but it is pretty. I mean, it's not just structural, but it's also pretty on the finished product. As I sew these down, each gets a piece of twine about a foot long. I make sure that when I melt this twine, I am not near the tacron on the sail. It would be a crime to melt a hole into my sail at this step. I use a wire to run a piece of twine through the holes, and I use an alpine butterfly loop knot on all of these. I like that knot so much. That alpine butterfly loop is one of the few knots that'll stay on this kind of crappy nylon string. For one reef point, all the tie-off points on the same face get the same treatment. So say I'm doing the upper reef point first. On one face, the butterfly loop, that knot, ties the ends together at each patch to make a big loop coming off of each patch. On the opposite face of that, on that same reef point, on the opposite face, those patches, I tie that butterfly loop and I try to work the knot so it's pretty close to the patch and there's just a single long tail hanging. Then I can tie little figure 8 knots, maybe at 2 points in this tail, and one somewhere near the middle and one somewhere near the end. And this makes it so that when I'm putting in a reef, I know that in one hand I've got a loop, in the other hand I've got a tail with knots in it, and it's like a soft shackle. You just do a lark's head knot with the loop side, and you run the tail through. When you're putting in a reef, you want to make this just a no-brainer, and this, for me, is the way to do that. I can quickly and easily tie off reef connection points. It is a little bit more difficult to untie that lark's head knot on thin twine like this, but if you're taking out a reef, you're going to have a little more time. So it's the simplest knot that I'm aware of that will just quickly and easily tie up a reef point, tie up your sail when you're putting in a reef. So on the other reef point, I reverse the orientation of the loops and the tails. So say for the upper reef point on this, if I've got my sail up, the higher reef point, I'll say all the loops are on the port side and all the tails are on the starboard side. On the lower reef point, I reverse that. So all the loops are on the starboard side and all the tails are on the port side. That way, when I'm putting in a reef, I don't get the tie-offs that I'm grabbing confused, and I don't grab tie-offs for the wrong reef points when I'm putting it in.
Okay, let's talk about how this thing gets rigged. So this mizzen, I only put a single block on top of the mizzen up there, and then I used that lace, that cord lacing it down, and I just tied a bowline up top and then ran that line through, so there's no separate line to lace and to haul up that sail. You can retie it, but this stays on the mast. So my spar, you can see that running through this snotter that I put a real eye on that one. And the same thing at the bottom of this. The bottom, there's no separate line between lacing it and downhaul tension, and that downhaul cleat is right there. Halyard tension on that cleat. And I just realized I turned this thing 90 degrees. Let me fix this. Okay, so that's what it should look like. So the eye that I run that downhaul through should be on the starboard side, downhaul cleat, halyard cleat, and then get it wrapped, and you got to be careful with the tension on that wrap. And then once it's set, you can leave it as long as that line doesn't stretch too much. That's my snotter adjustment right there. Let me jump back out of the boat. And then you can see my mizzen. Ooh, I should shorten that boomkin a little bit to keep that from getting tangled up, because it is getting tangled up back there. Anyways, that mizzen, let me fix that tangle. Then that mizzen gets sheeted on that bumpkin, and that mizzen line runs up to that starboard kind of midships cleat right here. Okay, I'm not putting up the mainsail yet. A little bit of a wind coming down this ramp. So when I am running this full sail, so 30 inches back as this gets laced on the yard, 30 inches back on that lace, I tied one of those alpine butterfly knots that I like so much. And then when I tie my halyard, I do a, anchor hitch. If I were reefing this and it were lower down the mast, I would tie these around the mast to keep the yard on the mast. But because the attachment point is so close to the yard up on the mast, that halyard block, I don't worry about it. It's laced all the way back. Oh, I gotta set up my main sheet. Okay, main sheet. So main sheet starts at the transom, and then one line comes off of a bowline to come up through a block, and then I use that back end of that spar for luff tension. Then that line runs back through that block, and then it's back to this block, and then my main sheet comes through that block. The front of the boat might be the last thing we're rigging. Oh, okay. I gotta tack my mainsail down. And then I've got these two blocks here for snotter tension. This snotter line runs from my spar. It's tangled up. Runs from that spar to this snotter, and I run this thing up to that screw that's 7 feet up the mast, and so that it gets vang tension and it gets outhole tension in the same line. And then I run that line from there down to a block at the bottom of the mast, and then that line can either come to this cleat or to a cleat at the back of the main thwart. I think that's it. I'm gonna get this thing on the water before I put this mainsail up because it's kind of gusty. And then I'll put that mainsail up.
I didn't film making the spars in the yard on this. I did, for this build, make one spar for the mizzen, but that spar for the mainsail I already had, and the yard for the mainsail I already had. They're in the diagram at the beginning of the video, the measurements for those, and if you made it to here, you'll figure it out. Building my boat is finished. Man, there's no other way to celebrate and close this besides taking advantage of the light winds and show it off to the neighborhood. Okay, maybe one better way to close it. Get it wet. Take it on a shakedown sail and start making adjustments. Even if you follow the build like this as closely as possible, the boat that you built is uniquely yours. With use, it's going to further get customized to do exactly what you want it to do. I'm trying to wrap up editing before I take this boat out for the 5th time at this point. My plan for this time I take it out is to get some insulation panel that's the same thickness as the frames and put it down in the sole of the cockpit and sleep on board tonight. Put out an anchor in some sheltered cove, trim the mizzen hard, and sprawl out on the sole wrapped up in a sleeping bag or two with the stars passing overhead. Build's done. Time to enjoy it.